And please let us now go to Kingston, Ontario, where Professor Adnan Hussein is back. Happy Ramadan. And Dr. Liam O'Mara is joining us from the hills, I hope, above river. There you are. Dr. Liam O'Mara and Professor Adnan Hussein are going to have a question. They're going to talk about fascism. We were just talking about fascism. Usually I disappear but I may pop in and out because I've been reading some Michael Parente over the weekend about fascism. You have to unmute yourself, Dr. Liam O'Mara. Thank you.
Yeah, I tend to go back and forth so it's not throwing background sound or noisy cats into it.
Don't worry, you're fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
You should stick around, David. This is a topic you wanted to discuss with Liam, and I just said, well, let's just cut through all of that bureaucracy and make it happen.
Yeah. Monday. So we have time. We have an hour, if that's okay with you. And we can also take questions. Dr. Liam O'Mara, you wrote a piece for Down with Tyranny about fascism. For young people to understand fascism, is it fair to say that fascism is in the employ of the richest 1%, that you cannot have fascism without oligarchs manipulating the lumpen proletariat?
Generally speaking, yes. It does.
What does lumpen proletariat mean? And why do I use words that I don't understand?
Well, how would you define it? Like,
I would say the people who stormed the Capitol on January 6th were the lumpen proletariat. They're not wealthy people. They get off on, they identify with their oppressors. They have contempt for themselves and the poor. They fall prey to nationalism and power and the police. They love the police, but they don't stand for anything other than control, violence, and hatred for the other.
It's it's not a bad way to put it, really. But really, there's it really does introduce what is in some ways an artificial divide in the working class between more liberal thinkers and more conservative thinkers, because the features that you're describing there, that deference to authority, for example, the deference to hierarchies and wealth and whatnot, is sort of fundamental to conservative neurologies. And there's a basic split always in people. I mean, we can go back and forth a little bit here and there. Education makes a big difference, but a basic conservative impulse and a liberal impulse co-evolved because they both serve a useful function as, for our hunter-gatherer ancestors. What we often tend to do when we set up a lot of divisions like that is we make it harder to reach across to people, because you can actually appeal to people on either side of that divide. This is one of the reasons that the Nazis and several other fascist movements explicitly adopted elements of socialist messaging, because socialists were making inroads into that working class. What we would in the US think of like as a traditional white working class. It was working there, and they wanted to pull those people away and toward their nationalist agenda. So they stole a lot of the same terminology that was working.
Right.
But in general,
so let me do something, and then I'll open it up to Professor Hussein. Indulge me. Give me 5 minutes, Professor Hussein, and help me out here. And Dr. O'Mara, help me out here, because most people, including me, don't really understand. We're not as educated as the two of you. We don't understand what fascism is. It's been used, the term has been used by the right to describe cancel culture, and Bernie is a fascist because he wants a totalitarian government to take over our health care. So I want to lay down the predicate here and establish a baseline so that our listeners understand, because your piece in Down with Tyranny, Professor, was you spelled out what fascism is. And I want my listeners to understand who the people are who support Donald Trump, why they are, in fact, fascists
Right.
and crypto Nazis.
Yeah,
And that you're not losing the argument, and why liberals and the left are not fascists, nowhere near what Mussolini, Franco, and Hitler were proponents of. We are witnessing the rebirth of fascism in America. As I understand it, I want to hammer this home because I've been watching, Louder with Crowder and these right-wingers who accuse our side of being fascists, because you cannot, if you're a Republican, you cannot describe what you believe in and then describe what Mussolini, Franco, and Hitler believed in, because they're synonymous. So you have to distort history, because it's unacceptable that America fought fascism, our greatest war, and then at the same time we have a Republican Party now that believes in fascism. And that's not being simplistic. That is the truth. The Republican Party is the party of fascism. Strong military, strong cops, tax subsidies for the oligarchs, balance the budget on the backs of the working poor. Anti-union, anti-laborer, nationalism, patriotism, and fear of the other. There is no difference between Mussolini, Hitler, in terms of ideology. It was amplified, but what we have in the Republican Party are crypto fascists, and left to their own devices, they will give you Mussolini and an iteration of Hitler. That is the right wing. Left to their own devices, the right wing will lead to fascism. Left to their own devices, the left wing, unchecked, will lead to an authoritarian, the working class being the rulers of the state. And there are problems with that as well. Is that a fair assessment of what we're up against?
It really is. And if you like, then for your listeners, I can give you like the quick 3-minute or so definition of how I use this. But to start with, you're absolutely right about that need to project outward. And it's a common technique among both classical and neo-fascists to call the other side the real fascists and obscure what it really means. And a lot of that has to do with the way we have associated the term, especially with, you keep mentioning Hitler and Mussolini. There were tons of other fascist regimes, tons of other fascist political parties, movements in countries all around the world.
I think Hungary had one before.
Hungary did, exactly. Yeah, the Greeks did. Obviously, France, Portugal. There were tons of Latin American movements. There's a bunch of movements in the Mideast. Fascism has been a significant ideology for a century now. But most movements that are fascist by definition don't use the word. And we associate the word with Hitler, Mussolini, and World War II, which means when you say fascist to someone in America, they think of death camps and they think of military force. They think of the Gestapo kicking in doors and dragging you off to Treblinka, and not much else, because we just don't know much else. What I try to do for students for fascism, one of the least understood political ideologies, is the same thing I do for all of them when I talk about political and social philosophies. I break it down by using a handful of characteristics. There are a handful of distinct liberal characteristics that define political liberalism, and they are consistent over time. I see this all the time on the right. They're like, well, classical liberalism is different from liberalism. No, a liberal is a liberal, period. If someone diverges from that, they're not a liberal. The word has a consistent meaning based around a set of characteristics. So for fascism, there's 9 basic ones that I use. The first is that all fascisms are anti-liberal, which means they're opposed to basic Enlightenment values, human rights, free press, that kind of stuff. But they're also anti-conservative, which means they tend to have reactionary social views, and they tend to argue for a kind of national rebirth. There's a kind of radicalism to fascism that isn't present in any conservative movement. This is where you get all those, like the Nazi rhetoric about degeneracy, degenerate cultures, right? Which we still see on the right today in the US. Fascisms are all nationalist. And one of the biggest problems with pointing to that in the US is that almost no one has a clue what nationalism means. Nationalism and patriotism have completely different objects. A patriot loves his country, and a nationalist loves his nation. A nation is a group of people with something in common, which means it's a pretty flexible definition. How you define that group of people really varies, but it's not a country. So nationalism is quite a distinct ideology from there, but all fascist movements are radically nationalist, often hyper-nationalist, and they tend to have elements of severe chauvinism. It isn't just that my nation is great, it's that by definition, yours must suck. Then there's the conspiracy theories. All fascist movements use conspiracy theories. Hannah Arendt used this in her study of totalitarianism, noted that there are internal and external enemies to all forms of totalitarianism, and fascism is simply a form of totalitarianism. They are different terms. That's another problem you get in the US, is people squish those together. But just think about the massive amount of conspiracy theories that float around the contemporary right today, and then just going back forever on the American right. They also, all forms of fascism, this is one of the things that gets complicated for philosophers dealing with it, is that it doesn't have a strong logical or philosophical base. It's based more in emotion and spectacle. It wants to pull you in. It wants to get you sucked into the crowd, and yes, and you're marching and saluting. But it's not getting you with like reasoned arguments. It's getting you with a feeling that wells up inside you. And a related aspect of that is the use of charisma. Fascists always point to great leader cults. This is one of the Achilles heels of fascism and neo-fascism, is that they have a real difficulty creating an appropriate succession mechanism, because it's all based around the great leader. When the great leader is dead, who takes over now? It isn't the system that matters, it's the leader. Last 3 are a little easier, but one's kind of complicated in the US because we often, on the left in the US, use corporatism strangely. It's not just about corporations and corporate control. It's a merger of the state and corporate interests. And the biggest single feature of corporatism is its opposition to the left and to labor unions. So fascist movements are always deeply anti-communist, anti-socialist, anti-labor union. And they want to basically co-opt labor and use a state organization, kind of like a guild there, to sort of speak for them and not the workers speaking for themselves. Populism is our 8th characteristic. Populism would be like pointing to the forgotten man, the silent majority. There's a kind of implied racism frequently in populist rhetoric, but it's basically appeals to that lumpen proletariat you mentioned, appeals to the working class, but instead of on the basis of class interests, on the basis of like race or nationalist interests, but it still has that appeal to common workers. That's where left and right populism overlap.
Amazing.
The last is super easy. It's just fascism is always misogynistic. It tends to focus on traditional values, like traditional gender and sex norms.
Wow, it's fascinating. So is fascism human nature? Do somebody like Trump, is it just instinct?
Oh, no. No, none of our political philosophies are per se rooted in human nature, but they can all develop elements from it. They can exploit certain parts of our psychology. But so
Trump knows what he's doing. Steve Bannon is coaching, or was coaching him. Steve Bannon, somebody was coaching him?
Sort of. There are certain appeals that you make. There are certain characteristics that a person could have that makes the fascist approach to politics make more sense. Trump is not a deep thinker. Trump doesn't read, he watches TV. So Trump probably doesn't have the slightest idea what fascism actually means, but he's been spouting fascist gibberish for decades. So that's more of like his own biases lead him in that direction. Other people like Bannon absolutely know what this is, and he knows what right populism is. And they can like coach them to like, okay, focus on that, draw more of that out. But it's sort of like playing with his own natural skills. Trump is a pretty natural politician. He's just a terrible administrator and businessman. He doesn't know what the hell he's doing, but he's really good at manipulating people politically. And that plays really well with fascist demagoguery, where the emotion is all that matters.
You say that in the piece for Down with Tyranny, you say that fascism is anti-globalist.
Essentially, in that it's nationalist,
right.
But globalism itself is rooted in anti-Semitic conspiracy theories about Jewish control over the world. So it's anti-globalist because there's an implied anti-Semitism in classic fascism that then gets translated into the contemporary world, even though people often have no idea what they're doing is trading.
Which falls into the conspiracy theories that they like to promulgate.
The globalism part falls much more into the conspiracy theory.
But economically, they're not anti-globalist.
Yeah, there's a kind of economic nationalism that often comes in with that emphasis on the local working class. In that way, Bernie and Trump actually have something in common. They both talk about helping the workers here, and they both are critical of immigration and that sort of thing. There's a kind of economic nationalism that left and right populism can share. And that can be opposed to globalization. But globalization and globalism are a bit different. Globalization in its economic dimensions, like neoliberal corporate control over trade.
Right.
Versus,
I want to bring Professor
toward like one world government kind of thing.
I want to bring Professor Adnan Hussein in on this, but you say that fascism is anti-liberal. Very important. The term liberal and neoliberal, the fascists on the right are now calling themselves liberal in the tradition of John Stuart Mill and Locke, and because liberty is freedom. The abolitionists were liberal. The the white men who signed our Constitution were liberals because they believed in the freedom of the human spirit.
Right.
But if you're a Trump devotee, a Republican, or a fascist, you are opposed to personal liberty.
Absolutely. And it's one of the reasons, and this is problematic because fascists often flip the rhetoric. They spin things around. There's a lot of kind of double speak that's involved in there. Because of right-wing policies over the last 40 years, we are now ranked 52nd in the world in individual liberty. The US is so far out of the upper ranks there that it's not even funny anymore. Literally 52nd place. And yet we're still the land of the free and the home of the brave, and we're the freest country on earth. And this is where we have, it's nonsense. They think that they stand for freedom, and yet they're the ones who want to ban drugs, ban porn, and everything else. Like they're constantly passing all kinds of.
Well, the libertarians, in all fairness, the libertarians, which I think are a soft entry point into fascism.
They can be, and they tend to be a bit more open to those areas. But then because there's that crypto nationalist element of it, it does lead people toward. There is a libertarian to fascist pipeline, but I also know people in the Libertarian Party who are explicitly socialists. I mean, there actually is a socialist caucus in the Libertarian Party. So it really is quite diverse.
Okay. Professor Hussein, do you want to join in here?
Sure. Yeah. No, that was a great.
This is fantastic. This is
wonderful.
This is so important.
Anatomy of fascism. I guess a couple of questions that I have where you would fit certain phenomena that I think are fairly intrinsic, with whether you would categorize them, where you would categorize them. One is this sense of victimhood that seems so important, a sense of grievance, either from a historical experience, like, we were stabbed in the back, with the Versailles Treaty and various things. And that's something that we see so much, is that on one hand, they may vocalize some genuine complaints with the current system that is certainly oppressive towards working people, but there's a whole litany of other things that are imagined grievances and this whole cult of victimization that drives the sort of politics of it. I'm wondering if that's something you would say is pretty intrinsic, and where you fit this into.
Yeah, absolutely. It falls under what I was mentioning here in our little couple-minute version of this, under conspiracies. I often take that apart a bit more in classes and talk about the defensive ethos of fascism, where you're looking at enemies. And generally speaking, whether it's an internal or external enemy, it has to be something that's not real. It has to be easily defeated. And grievance culture is perfect for that, because the Dr. Seuss thing is bullshit. Like nothing, I mean, there's no problem. Elect me and the problem is solved. And then that's that. It has to sound like a great threat, so it scares you, but it has to be so much of a non-issue that putting the leader in place solves it immediately. So yeah, outrage and grievance culture fits into that same conspiratorial mindset. It's ultimately all those things are based on complete bullshit. And another place it overlaps is that emotional basis, what in classes I tend to refer to as the anti-rational component of fascism, where you don't want someone to think deeply about the issue here. You just want to get them riled up. And a sense of like grievance over something, a sense of artificial outrage over something is perfect for that.
Yeah, for polarizing people. But also, I think you're right that this anti-rational tendency is not just a matter of avoidance, but it's actually constitutive of how they even imagine their politics, that we have to free ourselves from all of these constraining, complexifying things that are robbing us of our vitality. So there is this kind of idea of struggle for its own sake, in order to recharge, in fact, actually to be barbaric is so that you can be civilized, right?
And weakness, yeah.
That's right, yes. And so that element of valorizing violence for its own sake as a kind of emblem of strength and of creating the personality that they imagine as an ideal masculine kind of authoritarian personality. That issue about emotion and spectacle seemed very crucial to this, that there isn't a politics, at least for most people, that is directed towards particular ends and can be described as a rational process, but is this kind of celebration, you might say, of emotion, of violence, as its character, really.
Yeah, I mean, think about the use of a lot of the militia imagery and the kind of sort of martial character of a lot of different groups here. I mean, the motivations for the Proud Boys are deeply fascist, Western chauvinist, all this basic stuff here, but it also has that sense of implied hyper masculine, barely restrained violence to it, and there is a sense in which they glorify in that. This is where some of the classic fascists in both Italy and Germany misquoted some elements from Nietzsche in order to point to that, the great blonde beast sort of thing, that we need to unchain this beast, and they just totally messed it up because Nietzsche's a total anti-nationalist, but whatever. Right. But it worked perfectly as...
So for the lumpen proletariat, when you look at the Proud Boys, they personify the lumpen proletariat. For them, it's violence in search of an ideology. The violence comes first. They're looking for an excuse to punch.
Sure, yeah. I mean, in a sense,
and that's a historical, with fascism, that has always been the case, that they're thugs, they're enforcers, wrap themselves in the flag, fear of the other, but basically they just want to punch and get punched.
Every fascist movement is going to be recruiting in the bars and on the waterfronts and whatnot. It's recruiting, tough guys who are looking for a fight, and it gives them a way to express that anger. It gives them a target. And this is why conspiracies are brilliant, because conspiracy theories are inherently simplistic. It's a way of taking a much more complex gray world and boiling it down to a simple us versus them. And an us versus them worldview is perfect to someone who wants to fight.
Professor Hussein, to me, this is a lesson. I mean, on this show, we should be teaching this lesson every episode, because I don't think enough people, I think we take it for granted that we understand what fascism is. Most people don't. I mean, I have friends on the left who think Hitler was a socialist because Nazi had, can you explain? I mean, I just think you have to repeat this history over and over again, what fascism is and how to spot it.
Yeah, well, that's why that rundown from Liam was so helpful, because, you know, a lot of people were making the argument, and with some justice perhaps, that Trump wasn't full-blown fascism. Maybe it was inchoate or incipient. There were some characteristics, and you could definitely fit him with several of these, including this so-called charismatic leader, and so on. But one thing that was lacking, there were a few things that were lacking maybe early in his candidacy and early in his administration. And one was that it hadn't yet translated into street thuggish violence, right, in the early period. It was still kind of within the realm of politics, and so on. But when you started to see those Michigan, you know, those people on the steps of the Capitol gosh, what's the capital of Michigan?
Is it Lansing?
Yes, Lansing, yes. So at the state capitol, that's when it seemed to me that something was mobilizing now, and it was translating from an image or a prototype of fascist kinds of politics into a movement that could really become serious.
And we saw it online. We may not have seen it. We saw it. We saw it virtual thuggery.
Yeah, there's a lot of
expression. Anybody out on 4chan would have seen that. Yes,
yeah,
that's right.
But not much in the streets.
Right, exactly. But it wasn't mobilized to actually intimidate people on the streets in public culture. It was happening in these discursive spaces. So when
the misogyny, in terms of the misogyny, though, I think a lot of women on the left were victimized on Twitter and social media by the Trump thugs.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely. Well,
I'm sorry I interrupted you.
Deeply unpleasant. Yeah. I mean, it certainly was a kind of verbal
and the doxing
violence. Yes. Mm-hmm. So when it translated into that, that's when it seemed like it really became, you know, potential. But what I'm concerned about now is something that I've been saying since Trump was defeated electorally, and finally, you know, the ambiguities about whether he would keep contesting or not have basically been resolved, is that a lot of people are going to think that it really is just a matter of the charismatic leader and not the wider set of characteristics that Liam was just articulating and enumerating. Those are still present in the right wing that is finding all sorts of ways to retool itself to undermine the current liberal, you know, the current Weimar, you know, if you want to think of it that way, you know, of a weak sort of neoliberal president and administration. And that's why I think this whole business about the border, they're trying to establish that as a crisis again. That was so useful in Trump's rise. It really tapped into all of those fears, those paranoid conspiracies, the scapegoating of the stranger, the immigrant, and so on. And they're turning right back to it. And I think potentially very effectively. So that's an area where I think we really need to contest this idea.
Let me follow you. You raised an interesting point, Professor Hussein, about the cult of personality. You said that the fascistic tendencies, either latent or present, persist regardless of Trump. Is that true, Dr. O'Mara? That if Trump disappears?
Absolutely.
Really? Okay.
So to build a little bit on what Professor Hussein is bringing up here, there's a real conflict among scholars of fascism about whether or not Trumpism is a form of fascism. And some of it really has to do with the whole forest for the trees sort of issue, because what we see with Trumpism is a kind of nascent fascism as opposed to a full-blown movement, largely because the circumstances are different. The circumstances in the original rise of fascism, in the 20s and 30s, the world was a very different place after World War I than it is now. You were dealing with profound social and economic crises, massive disruptions, and you could play on a lot of that to build these movements much faster. What we've had building up here, and this is where we have to divorce ourselves from the Trump issue specifically and look at the drift to neo-fascism overall, is that we've been making steady progress on this since the 1960s. Back then, you're laying down some genuinely off-the-wall sort of ideas like the John Birch anti-communist sort of conspiracies out there. But back then, conservatives could push that to the side and say, oh, that's fringe stuff. And people genuinely freaked out when Goldwater got the nomination, like, oh my God, this is just, But by the time you get to Reagan, that approach has completely taken root of the Republican Party and the old conservative movement. And conservatism has been in terminal decline ever since in this country. We don't really have a significant conservative movement on the right anymore. It's primarily in the Democratic Party. What Reagan did was he took a lot of those basic elements of fascism and brought them into the right's mainstream in the US. And I can point to examples of every single one of those 9 features in Trump's rhetoric, and we can also take them back into Reagan's rhetoric. What's different in the US is the circumstances. Our world looks very, very different. So the movement towards, say, the street violence, the street politics that Dr. Hussein pointed to there, being such a late part of it, in an organized fashion, yeah, but that militia culture has also been building up for decades. And as soon as Trump started speaking, from 2015 on, there was a massive spike in hate crimes in this country. And we always have had those attacks. In the last 25 years, the FBI has consistently pointed to right-wing and white supremacist movements as the greatest terror threat in this country. And that also is related to this incipient, inchoate fascism that's been building up here. It's just a slower process because we aren't in such a profound social and economic crisis yet.
What were some of the examples of Reagan's rhetoric? How does he fit?
With Reagan, again, you have the, there's the constant attacks on basic Enlightenment values of human rights. Look at the states' rights versus civil rights rhetoric there. You have his support for apartheid South Africa. There's also the kind of rebirth movement that you see in Reagan. His
Morning in America.
Morning in America.
Morning in America was trying to resurrect what he saw as a dying conservative movement and breathe new life into it. Definitely chauvinistic nationalism that you can see there. And you can tie the militarism obviously into it. Reagan is one that gives us our massive national debt with his arms buildup. Conspiracy theories, oh my God, from the 60s on, Reagan constantly recycled John Birch Society propaganda. He was deep in that nonsense. And also the heavy anti-communist element. Again, from the 1960s on, Reagan was hardcore harping on anti-communism and fear of the left. What's one of the first things he did? He crushed a labor union, when he got into office as president there.
The air traffic controllers.
Yeah. And I mean, think about the whole cult built around Reagan, both in his life and, after his presidency. I mean, they basically deified the man as, so it still fits that kind of great leader idea. Almost every single element is very easy to see already in Reagan, but the social circumstances are so different because we had just begun our decline industrially. We're 40 years into it now. And while the situation still is nowhere near as bad as 1920s Italy or 1930s Germany, it is still much more fraught today, which is why you can see a rise in Proud Boy violence or whatever. We're getting much closer to that level of desperation.
What was Bitburg?
It's been there for a while.
What was Bitburg about? When he laid a wreath at Bitburg.
When he visited the cemetery?
Yeah, and he laid a wreath in front of Nazi soldiers. It was
he went to a German war cemetery that happened to have dead SS soldiers in there. I mean, people try to spin that as some kind of a goof. And it's really not. I mean, Reagan has a long history of deeply racist statements. I mean, he had a lot of, he rattled off all kinds of words for African Americans and Jews and whatnot, same as Nixon did. This is not really.
There's a tape of him. There's a new tape of Reagan calling Nixon and making him laugh while he makes fun of African ambassadors to the UN.
Exactly. Yeah. No, they're pretty simpatico on that. The Bitburg visit was a dog whistle.
Was it? All right. So let me bring this. So he was trying to put an end to World War II. That was what we were told, that he was going to Germany. It was a state visit. He went to Normandy, and the way it was sold to the American people, my father, who served in World War II, it was sold to the greatest generation that we are at total peace with Germany now. They're our ally in the war against the Russians. And there were good men during World War II, to coin our president. There were good men on both sides. He was basically laying a wreath at the gravestones of SS soldiers.
Right.
Was it Elie Wiesel? I think it was Elie Wiesel who told him not to go there.
Wiesel spoke out against it. Quite a few people
So
did.
you're saying that it wasn't a dog whistle because it was open.
Well, it was a dog whistle because they said it wasn't. They gave the alternative rationale that it was giving us here, that there was, no, I'm just trying to close a chapter, and there were good people on both sides, and now we're not enemies anymore. But German leaders don't go to Nazi cemeteries. They just don't. This is one of the problems with the way that Japan still hasn't dealt with its own militaristic history, and they still have that same veneration for those military leaders. And it complicates Japan's relations with its other East Asian neighbors. The Germans have far more fully come to terms with how bad that past was. And they spent an entire year teaching about Nazism and the Holocaust in German high schools. They really drill into people's heads that radical nationalism is a bad idea. They don't honor those soldiers, but.
Okay, so this is why this is so important to me. I cannot wrap my head around the idea that Reagan used that trip to Normandy to send out dog whistles to the fascists in America by laying a wreath at Bitburg. And yet Michael Moore talks about getting on a plane with his friend and flying to Bitburg to protest Reagan, that there were people smart enough to completely understand what Bitburg was about. And I'm sorry?
In the U.S. knew it too.
I'm sorry, what?
The neo-Nazi right in the U.S. heard it too. The Klan heard it too. I mean,
I cannot accept that. I cannot accept that the president of the United States would use SS soldiers. What was this, 84?
Endorsed Reagan's run in 1980 by saying that his platform sounds like it was written by a Klansman. When Reagan put this stuff out there, he put it in a very innocuous way that we wouldn't all pick up on. But the Klan heard it, and the neo-Nazis heard it, and they knew what he was talking about. The Republican platform in 1980 is deeply reactionary and racist, but it's written in a friendlier way, which is why we don't look back at Reagan as kind of a proto-Trump, and we absolutely have to. The fact that we
make America great again was his
we didn't
slogan.
learn those lessons then, and it frustrates me that we're decades after this, and we're still thinking that Trump is some kind of weird aberration. No, Trump is absolutely predictable. Trump has been the direction this country's been going for a long time, and much worse is going to come after Trump. The fact that Trump was this successful means we have a much worse demagogue in our near future.
So as a kid, I can remember 1968, the Republican convention, and Ronald Reagan dipping his toe to challenge Nixon. And my father said to me, Nixon is going to be the worst president in our lifetime, but if Reagan gets elected, we'll have curfews.
Mm-hmm.
That's what he said. We will have curfews.
He was right. Reagan's path, both then and in his attempted primary challenge to Ford in '76, was both to stake out a position farther to the right than anybody else. And that was a very conscious strategy adopted by Reagan's campaign team to stake out that position to the right. Reagan literally suggested on the campaign trail that the U.S. would send troops to protect Rhodesia, the white supremacist government in Zimbabwe. I mean, this is a guy that throughout his entire time in the White House defended apartheid South Africa.
And so Nixon got elected. So my memory is my dad said Reagan will initiate curfews. Everybody will have to be inside by 8 o'clock. And then I watched Nixon get elected running on law and order. Law, that is the most terrifying term to hear a president talking about law and order. And then George W. Bush, after 9/11, came up with an agency called Homeland Security, which now has been normalized. But I mean, when I heard, I thought, are you effing kidding me? The Homeland?
It has that
blood and soil. That's just blood and soil, right?
Exactly. That's some pretty neo-Nazi, allusions to it. That whole law and order thing. This is a big problem here too. And honestly, I'm constantly trying to say that liberals cannot recognize the enemy and call out the enemy. They refuse to do it. And our refusal to do it is why the left is losing in this country. Nixon's use of law and order, Reagan's use of law and order, George W. Bush's, Trump's. This is actually just all it's doing is pulling back Jim Crow rhetoric. Because law and order means oppressing poor and brown and black people. That's literally all it has ever meant. It doesn't mean obey the law because, I mean, hell, these Republican administrations are the most corrupt in our history. Reagan still has the record for the most indictments, although, if Trump had 2 terms, he might have beaten him. But these are not regimes that care about the law itself. They care about order. This is, sort of fun coincidence here, and I actually posted on my social media earlier today about this. Today is the anniversary of the founding of the Gestapo in 1933. That's what they mean. When the right is talking about law and order.
What year is it? What year? 32?
33.
33. So how many years is that?
Oh, God.
I think...
I'm terrible with that.
I think it's 87, 80. I think you get leather for that. We should buy leather for your Gestapo friends for the.
Yeah, but yeah, that's the order that they mean. They want people able to kick in the doors and drag people out. I mean, I don't know. Look at today, everyone's just like defending ICE as though it's always been around, and it's actually a relatively recent organization. We used to protect the border, but we didn't send people into kick in doors in frickin' Montana looking for people
and give them detention centers.
ICE is a Gestapo, and we have concentration camps, but there's a real dishonesty about that. Just think of the term concentration camp. If you say that in the US today, all people think about is the death camps. They don't even think about the rest of Nazi concentration camps. They're not thinking about like Theresienstadt or Dachau. They're thinking of Auschwitz and Treblinka.
But the rabbis, the Jewish intellectuals have said that detention centers are by definition concentration camps. You're not misusing the term.
Where did we put the Japanese during World War II? What's
concentration camps?
What's a term that everyone uses?
Detention center. It sounds better.
We say internment camps generally.
Right.
We interned the Japanese. We talk about Japanese internment is always the headline in the sections and books and whatnot.
Yeah, they get to learn a lot of new skills. They don't get paid, but it's valuable experience.
Right.
Right. Yeah, there's concentration camp life in a nutshell. Internment literally is for prisoners of war. By us continuing to use the term internment for Japanese Americans, we are using the same rationale that FDR did. We're basically saying Japanese Americans were enemy agents. They're by definition not internment camps, they're concentration camps. So are the ones in the border. A concentration camp is just pulling people together in one place and locking them all up.
Yeah, I remember vividly, this was 3 years ago, the detention centers, which still exist. I think they're just as bad. I'll ask you about that in a second. And the left, the liberals, started calling them concentration camps. And 20% of American Jews are effing morons. They are. They're the dumbest people I've ever met in my life. And they vote for Trump. And they immediately go, how dare you invoke concentration camps? You're demeaning the memory of the... And then the Jewish intellectuals said, listen, moron, these are concentration camps. Read a book, you Trump supporting.
It's a question
to the modern concentration camp in the Boer War in 1898.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, just rounding up civilians and locking them up is a concentration camp. And it doesn't matter if it's for, political prisoners, immigrants, undesirables, whatever. If you're rounding up a specific class of people and putting them in a big outdoor prison, it's a concentration camp.
Yes. Go ahead, Professor Hussein.
Well, I was going to say it's just a matter of how do you interpret what never again means. Is it just never again to us? Or is it never again should this kind of oppression of people take place? And if you stand in solidarity with others, then you interpret never again in that more universalist, like drawing from the experience of the Jewish people suffering the Holocaust, that nothing like this genocide should ever happen to anybody else. But you could also just say, well, it should never happen to us again.
The thing that I find so frustrating is I was taught the Holocaust is in all of us. We are all capable of falling prey to Hitler. And that you never forget this because it's constant vigilance, because all of us can fall prey to fascism. And yet I've explained away a lot of things that Reagan, Trump, George W. Bush have done, where I go, well, not Trump, but I'll say with Bush and Reagan and Poppy Reagan. And by the way, he's called Poppy because in the CIA, he dealt heroin. He's such a nice guy. He can't really mean, he's making difficult, I fall prey to this all the time. And so the Nazis were not socialists, right? Hitler was not a socialist.
No, the Nazi movement is explicitly opposed to the left and to socialism. The first people they started rounding up were socialists.
What about unions? Were the Nazis for unions or against
unions?
unions?
Outlawed unions. They explicitly outlawed labor unions.
Their economics were...
Well, this extreme nationalism of fascism and other ultranationalist kinds of movements is essentially to try and create this fictive solidarity that should overcome class consciousness, right? We all have to be unified, and that's why you have emotion, and that's why you have spectacle, because these things are not subject. We can all experience the spectacle collectively together, and we don't have to think then about, wait, my interests are opposed to yours because you're preventing me from earning a living wage, and you're not giving me, housing, and so on. And so it's to try and suppress that kind of politics of class difference within this great sort of mystical national unity.
Let me ask you about social issues. I'm not making this up. Oklahoma tried to outlaw cockfighting. I think they succeeded in it. And a state senator who wanted to defend cockfighting said, and I quote, "The first thing Hitler did when he took power was outlaw cockfighting." And that's, that has just been a default for the right wing. The first thing Hitler did was take away our guns, abortion, and I guess he allowed same-sex marriage because of Ernst Röhm. I've heard the right wing say that Hitler was very accepting of gays. It was a decadent culture, and
within the party before they took power, there was a kind of like, whatever, we'll tolerate this around people like Röhm, but the movement was always explicitly homophobic, and they actually overturned several Weimar provisions that actually were much more accepting of homosexual cultures in Germany.
Okay, so fascism is homophobic?
Well, again, traditional sex and gender roles. So,
okay.
There's
abortion?
misogyny, homophobia, all that kind of stuff. Yeah, that restoring traditional values.
So what about abortion and contraception and stuff like that?
It goes away. It varies a little bit.
Because of eugenics.
Right, exactly. But in many forms of fascism, I don't know, for example, like, the Italian, Salazar in Portugal, Franco, whatever, in Metaxas' Greece, there was a serious issue with abortion. And in Nazi Germany too, there was an issue with abortion, but it was because of the demographic fears that they felt. And this is true of fascist and neo-fascist movements everywhere. There's this desire for the nation to grow faster so you don't need immigration. You wanted lots and lots of German babies.
What about gun ownership?
Gun ownership, that's also a bit of right-wing bullshit there. The Nazis never banned guns. What they did was they took them away from Jews. All through Nazi Germany, Germans had plenty of guns. Just like today, the Germans still have plenty of guns.
Right. But that is an argument that I could see the right seizing upon. They took the first thing they did is they took the guns away from the Jews so they would be defenseless. That is an argument.
But it's not how they generally use it. They're trying to basically say that, any kind of gun control period is an attempt to take all of our guns or whatever here. And the Nazis took our guns. They didn't. They took them from their social undesirables. They took them away from Jews and socialists or whatever, and that was it.
What about fiscal austerity, balanced budgets?
Deeply opposed to. And this
deeply opposed to fiscal, or they were for it.
There's a fun element to this in the right in the U.S. too. And again, this is.
Well, I want to get clear here. So, it's my understanding that a fascist regime will appropriate fiscal austerity. That we need balanced budgets.
Generally not. They'll sometimes use the rhetoric. And this is where, again, there's an internal kind of contradiction there. And it's something we can trace back into the Reagan years. Reagan talked about the need for a smaller government and balanced budget, but Reagan massively increased the size and scope of the federal bureaucracy and massively expanded government spending. Trump did the same. As
did George W. Bush and Donald Trump.
Bush and H.W. Bush and, and Trump. Yeah.
While preaching austerity.
Well, they preach austerity, and this is because there's a coded language. It's actually a dog whistle. When they're talking about smaller government and austerity, what they mean only is social programs. It's critical of Johnson's Great Society. It's critical of welfare programs. It's critical of the New Deal. It's not critical of spending overall. They honestly don't give a shit if we spend $1 trillion in the military, but they don't want 1 red cent going to a brown family.
Right. So they want the money being spent on, they want the money being given to the richest 1% in terms of tax breaks
or to the military and the state. Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's so right. There's a contradiction. And I think this is another problem where liberals fall for it. They fall for the rhetoric and don't catch the dog whistle. That austerity language is only aimed at social programs. And we think that, you're being hypocritical. You're calling for austerity and against spending, but then you raise the budgets. And that is never going to work for them because it's not hypocritical at all. They know exactly what they're talking about. They only want to take money away from poor people.
I see. I took the test that we took a couple of weeks ago. I'm going to try to find it. Here it is. I have to drag it to find out where I fall on the political spectrum. So let me share this.
Which one did you do? The political compass or the?
Yeah.
Well, those are
turns out I'm a Nazi. No. Can you see that?
Yeah.
Surprise.
Yeah. Here I am. I'm next to Emma Goldman. Mm-hmm. A little further to the left, I believe, than Noam Chomsky.
No, that spot right there is right where Chomsky falls and where I fall as well.
Yeah.
We're all in the same spot.
Okay. And I took the test. I inhabit the left libertarian quadrant of the political compass. I guess I'm a libertarian. You spoke with. I'm more to the left than Bernie. Mm-hmm. Now, Biden is here. He falls like 1 or 2 boxes below Trump. Like he's right next to Trump in terms of authoritarian right-wing beliefs. Is that true?
No, it's absolutely true. All of our recent presidents and all of our major politicians, other than people like Bernie, have been in the authoritarian right. Bernie is a really rare exception because he takes us back, and actually Bernie is usually put a couple of points further over. The one with the big pictures on it is a little, it's because they're giant caricatures, it's hard
Right.
to fall. He's usually slightly further right even than that, but still, he's essentially a center-left libertarian.
Right. Right.
He's basically a centrist. He's a moderate. But honestly, a lot of the Democratic coalition used to fall into that area too. You used to have plenty of us in there, you know, in the FDR to Johnson years. But our politicians have drifted very, very far. The Overton window has shifted considerably. And a lot of this has to do with just how far right the Republicans have gone. And the Democrats basically pick up disgruntled conservatives and themselves drift farther to the right. You can see a significant chunk of that happening by the late 80s.
But when you see that Joe Biden is in the same quadrant as Benito Mussolini, Augusto Pinochet, Donald Trump, Bolsonaro, and Jim Belushi, that doesn't seem fair. Why is Jim Belushi? I'm just joking about Jim Belushi. So are we under threat of fascism with Biden? And do the Democrats fall under your, how many boxes does Biden check in terms of your?
Fascist and neo-fascist is only the very few rows on the top. There's a pretty broad continuum of authoritarian ideologies. Basically, if you're in favor of state power in general, as long as you're talking about, you know, policing and border control and everything else like that, you're going to end up on the authoritarian side of it. So
you're not worried. You're not worried of the Democrats.
No. And this is where, again, it's why I use key characteristics to define ideologies. The Democrats simply don't have, you know, the major features that would fall into fascism. But a lot of Democrats are quite conservative. They're often quite authoritarian. There are definitely plenty of neoliberals there. There are a lot of statists in the Democratic Party, for sure.
Define status. What is a statist?
You know, strong governments, state power, you know, more authoritarian. There are a lot of authoritarians in the Democratic Party, but not of the fascist variety, and generally not to the same extremes. The Republicans' major nominees in the last few cycles have all clustered in the very corner of that one, you know, very upper right. I mean, Ted Cruz is all the way in the upper right corner. And you know, what the Democrats have done is tended to fall very close. Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden both are very close to that. They're both quite far to the right and more than halfway up into the authoritarian quadrant.
Where was FDR when we took on fascism? Was FDR?
FDR is a center leftist. FDR is a little bit more authoritarian than Bernie, but center left. So he'd be about one to two spaces over to the left, but right around centrist. You know, the whole, like, you know, let's borrow whatever ideas work, but definitely not actual socialist. A lot of the policies that you see with social democrats in general are intended to prevent socialism by compromising between the two. That's what Bernie does. That's what FDR did.
Now, was Lindbergh and Prescott Bush, Harriman, that firm, were they fascists in the lead up to? And so was Joe Kennedy, who was a Democrat, right?
No, Lindbergh was quite explicitly, you know, fascist. And in a more of the classical sense too. We actually had a significant fascist movement in the US. This is where people always saying, well, it can't happen here. I've always just laughed. It's like, dude, you have any idea how significant the German-American Bund was, or the America First movement that Lindbergh led? You know, I mean, or think about the right populist leaders around the same time. Remember, like,
was Huey Long a fascist?
Yeah, Father Coughlin, the Huey Long, that whole like struggle there, all the populist rhetoric against FDR. Yeah, it's playing with the same kind of right populist, you know, quasi-fascist ideals. Right. No, there's a sharp continuum there, and it continued afterwards. That it never ever went away from American politics. But after World War II, we managed to relegate these things to extremes. We managed to say, well, you know, that this can't. There was a kind of bipartisan consensus around liberalism that you can see continuing. I mean, when I talk about the New Deal consensus, you look at like FDR's terms and Truman's. You got to include Eisenhower's as well. right? And then you get Kennedy and Johnson. Eisenhower was a Republican, but absolutely continued that New Deal consensus. And Nixon initially campaigned also as a liberal.
Okay, so here's the deal. I know that Professor Hussein wants to say something.
Oh, really?
This is really, really important because, as you said, the Democrats are too polite to educate Americans as to what we're up against. Is it fair to say, and this was at the top of the segment, is it fair to say that a Democratic politician has a moral obligation to explain what fascism is the way you have, and then say, we are up against fascists. The Republican Party is controlled by fascists. Is it immoral for a Democratic politician not to say that? I think it is. I think you cloud the issues unless you call something what it is. And Mitch McConnell, Donald Trump, Ted Cruz, Lindsey Graham, McCarthy, Scalise are fascists.
It's the short answer to that is that there's a problem with it and a need to do it. The problem is that most Americans don't have a fucking clue what it means when you say it, and all they think of is Nazi Germany, and they say, well, the Republicans aren't calling for death camps, therefore you're lying, it's just hyperbole. And what it does is it actually gives them a way to shut it out and call us liars.
But they call us communists.
Well, sure, but that isn't helpful either. That all that does is just deepens.
It is for them.
Problematic.
It's helpful for them.
Sure, but to their base, but it doesn't help us to actually get anything done or solve our problems, does it? That the issue there.
Well, I disagree with you for 1 second. I'll tell you why I disagree with you, Doctor.
Yeah.
I've always maintained that the Democrats and Republicans, if you look at it from a Manichaean perspective, Republicans left to their own devices are fascists. Democrats, until Clinton, when left to their own devices, were communists. If you really just played it out, if you let Roosevelt do what he wanted to do, it would be closer. He would make the communists happy. And if you let Reagan do what he wanted to do, he would have made the fascists happy. If you want to simplify things for the American people, especially after this conversation, if you want to make things really simple, left to their own devices, Republicans will give us fascism. Left to their own devices, the Democrats will give us communism.
That again, it's too simplified a rhetoric that actually, I mean, literally, because what FDR was doing was trying to prevent communism and socialism. There's no way, shape, there's no possibility that that any part of that New Deal consensus.
But it was germinated in collectivist thought, and
every bit as much in liberal Enlightenment thought. It's social democratic thought is as much liberal as it is some elements from socialism.
Too simplistic.
Explicitly anti-socialist because it's trying to break class consciousness, and it substitutes a welfare state to make up for the abuses of capitalism, which ultimately leaves the power in the hands of the capitalists. Social democracy leaves that power structure in place. Socialism tries to overturn it completely.
This is one of the best segments we've had. Professor Hussein, you wrap it up.
Oh no, it was great. And
it has to be taught over and over and over again.
Well, I think there's definitely room to continue the conversation. I hope Liam will come back, and maybe we can also talk a little bit about where we're ending now, which is the sort of failures of liberalism, what we need, to have that can actually confront this growing fascism in this fascist moment that we're dealing with. And then another area that often we neglect that I hope he'll come back and we can discuss further is also the relationship between fascism and empire and colonialism. So how that kind of militarism abroad has consequences in galvanizing fascistic culture internally in our domestic politics. So hopefully we can come back and continue the seminar. It's been great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Professor Hussein, happy Ramadan. When does it end?
In 2 weeks.
And how
2 weeks left.
And how are you feeling?
Oh, I'm feeling okay. You know, I'm weathering the storm. Soon I'll become an ethereal being. I will shuffle off this mortal coil and I'll just ascend into transcendence. That's the idea. Usually I just feel a little tired at the end of the month, but we'll look forward to the Eid festival. It'll be fun.
Any deep dish pizza tonight?
No, not tonight. Just ravioli.
Okay.
Something light.
Well, speaking of something light, let's talk physics. My head is spinning from all this. Let's talk to physicist and Parks Commissioner of Aurora, Illinois, Professor Mary Ann Cummings. Would you like to, before we say goodbye to Dr. O'Mara and Professor Hussein, is there anything you wanted to add to that?
Oh, anything I could add would just, require another hour of discussion because, for instance, somebody as complicated as Joseph Kennedy, or for that matter, who was it? The king that abdicated the throne.
The Duke of Windsor.
The Duke of Windsor.
Edward.
Yeah. These are considered still civilized people that had definite Nazi sympathies. And I don't think there's a hard break between a fascist Nazi and a normal human being, because certainly one guy or a small group of guys did not exterminate 12 million people in concentration camps. That took the active participation of many million more people. And I mean, the very willing participation of so many people. So
I've always been for collective guilt, but this country opposed it. They decided it was just the Nazis.
This country opposed it.
Huh?
Well, this country opposed it and then kind of welcomed Nazis into our national security apparatus.
I believe in collective guilt. I believe all Americans are guilty for the crimes that we commit overseas.
Yeah, well, Andrew Bacevich would actually agree with you that our very consumerist, self-centered, individualistic type of economy here is directly tied to the wars abroad and to imperialism. And that, the sensibility, if you want to stop the wars over there, we have to change our sensibilities to our consumption here. And we are
all gangsters for capitalism.
Yeah.
Andrew Bacevich was on the show.
Oh, he was?
Yeah.
You had Andrew Bacevich. Wow, when was that?
About 5 years ago. He told me Smedley Butler was a nutcase. He said Smedley Butler, there was this, supposedly the industrialists wanted to get rid of Franklin Roosevelt when he first took over, and I think GM, our friends from GM, wanted Smedley Butler, who was at the time the most decorated soldier in America, to take over. It was going to be a coup, and Smedley Butler went before, I think, the House or the Senate and exposed the coup. Of course, nobody went to prison. Andrew Bacevich said that Smedley had delusions. Have you heard that?
No, I haven't heard Andrew Bacevich's opinion of Smedley Butler. Smedley Butler could have been telling the absolute truth and has been as mad as a marsh hare by the time he said it. Those are not incompatible things, because when somebody goes through war, what
do you think is worse? What do you think is worse?
What?
Going through the wars that Smedley Butler went through, or having a first name of Smedley? I would think Smedley would make me crazy. I could handle the Spanish-American War and World War I, the Bonus March, but I think, hey, Smedley, I think that would get to me after a while.
It would be kind of like a boy named Sue syndrome. It either destroys you or toughens you up or makes you a psycho.
Who
The latter
names a
two,
kid Smedley?
completely consistent with being a highly decorated war hero. So,
I mean,
Thank you.
War is still
Dr.
a
O'Mara, I'd
racket.
love to have Dr. O'Mara back next week.
Yeah. What professor is in?
Oh, just whether he was crazy or not, war is still a racket.
Yeah.
Yes.
You know.
You're saying noisy. Turn it down.
Yeah, exactly.
Turn it,
Like, just do it
silencers.
quietly. Silencers.
Yeah.
Use silencers.
Well, it's kind of interesting. My father was too young for either the World War II or the Korean War, although my older uncles went to the Korean War. But no one I knew who, when I was a kid growing up, talked about the war, except for a German friend of my family's who told us one day about being a boy soldier in World War II and near the very end of the war. And he tells a story about, he gets separated from his unit and he encounters a very young American soldier. And they look at each other and they just look around and they just kind of shrug and they leave. And he just tells, I can't even begin to reproduce this story, but that was basically the essence of it. But that was the only one. In World War I, we had a concept of shell shocked. People really did understand that the war did something to people. But after World War II, that got suppressed. Isn't that weird? That got suppressed as a whole. People came back as war heroes, and then the economy was booming, and America was dominating the planet, and we won morally and physically and economically.
If you watch Mad Men, they kind of touch on. Draper was a Korean War vet, but but they had a lot of World War II vets in it, and the ones who saw real action, there was a race to self-destruct. Everybody fizzled out at a different time. Some made it through the 50s, some made it through the 60s, but by the 70s,
you have Roger telling Don at one point, that's the problem with your generation. You drink for the wrong reasons. They had real reasons to drink.
But I saw it with my father's generation because he enlisted. He was 16 and he enlisted. That's how badly he wanted to get away from my grandmother. And I watched his friends and they all seemed to have come home. There was equity, the GI Bill. They all, if you were white, if you weren't African American, and they all started at to the sound of the same starting pistol. And then I watched his peers all self-destruct at various times. Some made it into the 70s, the 80s, but the ones who lived into the 90s, well, if you made it to the 90s, but some of them, they all had some kind of PTSD. It just wasn't talked about.
But you couldn't talk about it because that was the good war.
Yeah.
Because if you talked about it, you would reveal what war really was. And I remember my socialist landlady when I was in college in the early 80s in Ann Arbor, Michigan.
She paid you rent. She paid you rent, right?
Just about. I mean, I was renting a room there, and we're talking 1950s prices in 1980. And this is like, Ann Arbor, which is like Berkeley, which is like any one of these high-end, university towns. But, I remember her sitting pontificating all the time, which was fun. And she would point to me with her cigarette and go, the problem with your generation, I said, ooh, what is it, Lizzie? You didn't have a good war. I'm going, I'm sure that's an illusion, but, as far as they were concerned, it was a good war. There was at least a purpose. We defeated Nazis, and that, unfortunately, for a lot of people, colored everything else. And I grew up watching the Vietnam War on my TV. I do have a nice memory of it, though, because I rarely saw my father laugh in those days. And there was somebody, so-and-so, ABC News, and he turns around and looks and he says, and I have no idea where I'm at. And my father just laughed aloud. It was kind of funny, but it was just this war. And I'm looking at this, and part of the reason I cannot be a proper adult now is because as a kid, I looked at the adult world and they were all out of their minds, still are. And, it's just like, which is, maybe why I was able to take in problem foster kids that nobody could deal with because I was kind of on their side.
Right.
Just don't kill anybody or, be smart about it or something. But, I can understand because it's like, we never dealt with this. I mean, I'm looking at this, even my parents were for the Vietnam War, but they were of that generation that wasn't quite hippies, but wasn't quite the World War II generation either. And they were, getting all the benefits without having explicitly the trauma. My mother remembers growing up during the Depression, but she had an incredibly resourceful mother, my grandmother, and everything got better. I don't begrudge them a penny. I remember my father going to law school. He ended up, having one of the biggest law firms in the state of Michigan, but the entire universe was set up for people like my parents to succeed.
Right.
Really, I mean, there was a time, you just got the big bounty of the post-war spoils and having no competition for a good generation. And that generation, benefited from that. So, it was weird how.
So you're saying we need to go to war with China?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
What was that? How did they describe World War I when all the Allworthies got together and decided they would, quote, have a splendid little war? I heard
that was Teddy Roosevelt. It was the
that
Spanish.
Teddy Roosevelt?
Teddy Roosevelt said that.
I guess I was listening to a PBS special or something, and I heard those words. And then, what happened was a nightmare they could never envision, of course.
Right.
And as I said, I did find out something about my grandfather. He was actually in that war. He never talked about it either. The only thing we got out of my grandfather were all these songs that he sang when my grandmother wasn't around. And, but he was an ambulance driver.
And your father became an ambulance chaser.
Yeah. Swing. Oh, the irony. Yeah. That was a job, by the way, set aside for conscientious objectors, as I later found out, was an ambulance drivers in World War I. And that is completely consistent with what my grandfather was. I couldn't imagine him harming anyone. I mean, so yeah, that.
Essentially, my grandfather was an ambulance driver during World War I because he loved the sound of blood-curdling screams. That was.
No, he did he?
Yeah, he just said to me, I wanted to fight in the war, but I was worried I would not hear blood-curdling screams, so I volunteered to be an ambulance driver.
What? You wouldn't hear that in the trenches?
You
should have volunteered to be the first round going over the barbed wire. But
this is a true story. Both my grandparents, but both grandfathers came to America. They were here for 5 years, and then they got a note from the government. Guess where you're going?
Oh.
You're going back with a gun. They returned to, yeah.
You actually could do more than one tour of duty back in those days?
I think World War I was one. No. They were immigrants. They came from.
Oh, I see.
They came from Europe.
Okay.
They came from Europe, and they were told you're going back to kill the people you fled. And I think they were more than willing to do that. I think they had no problem. One of my grandfathers was gassed and became a pothead. He became a communist and a pothead and a devotee of Moby Dick. He insisted everything was in Moby Dick.
Oh, the book, the novel.
Yeah. And he smoked a lot of dope.
Yeah, well, might have had some medicinal value for the effects of gas.
And he subscribed to the Daily Worker.
Oh, okay. Well, it's funny that communists and socialists are considered pie in the sky, but people who actually worked, I mean, real work, like work that 99% of suburbanites are incapable of doing right now.
Hang on, I think I have a joke. Hang on. My grandfather subscribed to the Daily Worker. He worked, he was an FBI agent, so he was monitoring Is that
But
a
he
joke?
comes from, was he the, oh, okay.
He worked for the FBI. He had to read the Daily. Go ahead. I'm
Oh,
sorry.
so he was one of the ones, I had a friend, the only Marxist Leninist I know, and she said back in the late 60s, early 70s, they could always tell these FBI guys, they were the only ones that paid their dues on time.
Wow. Wow. That's how you could tell who the
FBI guys were.
the agent provocateur was.
Yep.
There'd be no Communist Party if it weren't for all the FBI agents paying their dues.
You might think that's a joke. I think that's more of the truth than an actual joke. And why not? I mean, you needed an enemy here, right? I mean, that's kind of what the perpetual national security state always needs an enemy. They have to create one if a suitable one doesn't exist. So,
Right. Hey, how about this? This isn't gossip. This is Dr. Harriet Fraud was on the show earlier, and she said she was on a plane years ago before she was married, and David Rockefeller of Trilateral Commission fame asked her out on a date.
He did. I bet he did. And what did she say?
She said no. But can you imagine?
Oh my God, the glass of wine you would have been able to order on that date. And then she could have just said, oh, you're drunk. But
Well, that's all. Anyway.
Get the meal, get the see what a Rockefeller does for you on the first date. That would, or maybe did she know that he was in fact the David Rockefeller?
She knew, of course. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yes. It was a Chase man. He ran Chase and he owned Latin America, I believe. David Rockefeller.
Okay, but what was it? The Rockefeller, John D. Wasn't he Standard Oil?
Yeah.
Yeah. But that was like the great granddad. Okay.
It was John D., then John,
and
then the boys like Nelson, David.
Nelson.
And, there were like 6 or 7 Rockefeller boys.
Yeah, one of our more colorful VPs for about a year and a half. Was that?
He was better. It was the best Republican vice president in my life. Let me say goodbye. Let me say goodbye to Professor Hussein and Dr. O'Mara. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, both of you. Thank you. Thank you. All 3 of you have cats. Interesting.
Yeah.
What does that say?